Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to another Demystifying Post-Production Motion Monday. My name's Ellie, I'm a trainer at Maxon, and I'm joined once again by two very special people. Hey Chad and Dustin, how's it going?
What's up, Ellie? Good to have you back.
Ellie is
Happy
so,
Monday.
Ellie is so proper. I love it.
It's been 2 weeks, so I thought I'd come back with a bang.
Right.
So it's so good to be back. Yeah, I've not been here for a couple of weeks, so it's lovely to be here and see you both, and also with our lovely audience as well. So hey to Jay and Scott in the questions area already. It's good to be back with you all. So final week, before we get into what we're going to be doing, before I hand it over to Chad for some digital cinematography stuff, I thought I'd just talk about some of the stuff that we have going on at Maxon. So if you head over to the maxon.net events page, you can see all the stuff that we are doing as a whole collective. So our live sessions, for example, Demystifying Post-Production, aka today. We also have VFX and Chill, which is with Sept and Hashi, that's on Fridays. And then every Thursday, so every first and third Thursday, we have Maxon Color. And every second and fourth Thursday of the month, we have Ask the Trainer. And those are hosted on our Maxon Training Team YouTube live channel. But we don't just do live webinars. As you can see, we also have live events going on. And so we have a whole bunch coming up in October and November, and they're also found on this page. So we have Forward Festival, we have Broadcast India, which Jonas Pills is going to actually be attending in person, doing a bunch of cool stuff. We have Lightbox, and we have Adobe Max. And the three of us are going to be there, aren't we, guys?
Yes, reunion.
Oh yeah.
Reunion. We're going to be in person together in LA at Adobe Max, doing a whole bunch of mini workshops, doing some really fun things. Me personally, I'm doing a lot of stuff in C4D Light. Dustin, I know you're doing 3D and Photoshop, right?
Yeah. We'll be
Chad,
talking
I'm
about
sure, is doing
compositing.
magic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Lovely.
A lot
And
of good
Chad is
stuff.
doing some magic in Red Giant, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
That should be
I'm doing
fun.
some stuff on sparkles. My session's called Abracadabra because it's magic and sparkles. And
Oh,
yeah.
my titles are not that great. I might have to rethink mine. Yeah, so just a quick reminder, if you ever miss any of these sessions and want to catch up, all you have to do is head over to the Maxon Training Team YouTube channel. So here you can see the upcoming live streams for Maxon Color and Ask the Trainer, and also the recordings of the sessions that we run, all in their own playlist. So Demystifying Post-Production, which is the series we're doing right now, you can find a playlist for that. And I also want to talk about the fact that we're talking about live events. Those do get recorded as well, and they get uploaded onto the the main Maxon VFX YouTube channel. So recently, a bunch of us were at IBC in Amsterdam for like a 4-day event. And so if you ever want to catch up on some of those workshops and those live recordings, just head over to the main Maxon YouTube and you can find all those. And I imagine it'll be the same for Adobe Max. We're going to throw them on there as well. And finally, we love to thank you guys for being part of our live sessions and being part of our wonderful audience by giving you a free Maxon t-shirt. I'm not actually wearing mine for the first time ever. It's a little bit cold in England today, so I've got the hoodie on. But if you head over to the handout section of GoToWebinar, you'll find this PDF, and it has a special link. It's not the official merch store link, it's actually a secret one. All you have to do, type in the password digital cinematography, and it's good for one shirt. All you do is pay for shipping, and that cost depends on where you are in the world. And we have some other links on there for the project files for all of these topics, as well as the Maxon training webinar recordings, which is that YouTube link, and the Maxon.net events page, which we just took a look at. So also, let's say hey to everyone else in the chat, because I did it super early. There's only a couple of you in there, but now we've got hey to Greg, Drake, Scott, Megan. Nice to see you guys. Thank you for being here live. So as we said, final week today, where we're diving into some cool stuff. So Chad, do you want to?
Oh yeah, let me grab the screen while I'm doing that. Yeah.
There you go.
Okay. Let's see. Are you seeing my Cinema 4D? Yes, you are.
We are.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So we're going to recap the focal length conversation, and then we're going to dig deeper into the focal length business. And then after that, we are going to, well, what we're going to do is we're going to get to the point where we're talking about this like beautiful shot thing, where we take this shot that we've been looking at all month and then make it like super gorgeous at the end, the before and after. We'll show you step by step how we did that, and it will make sense theoretically after we've, since we've been talking about like focal length and light and all these different things all month long, kind of like the grand finale, so to speak. So just to recap again, we talked about this briefly last week, but here at Cinema 4D, oftentimes when people are adjusting cameras, it's very common to select a camera and then adjust like the focal length, and it seems like it just kind of zooms in and out. It just does like a basic zoom in and out. But as we talked about last week, we set up 3 cameras here. We have the red one with the very wide angle. That's a 15 millimeter. That's very wide. So again, the lower in millimeters that you go, the lower in numbers that you go, the wider that the focal length becomes, and the higher the focal length, then the longer we say that the focal length is. So we have the 30 millimeter, or excuse me, the 15 millimeter, and then we also have the 36 millimeter camera, and then we also have the 80 millimeter camera in the back. And the 36 millimeter, if I look through this camera, and I'm going to go ahead and turn off the doohickeys or whatever. This is the default camera setting in Cinema 4D. And as we get to a wider lens or a wider focal length, and then also adjust the distance to compensate for that, so we basically have the same framing, then you can see that we have a very different look. So this is with a 36 millimeter lens, this is with a 15 millimeter lens at the same framing. So again, that's with, well, you're not seeing my cameras anymore because I turned them off, but that's with a different camera and a different position of the camera to match the composition of the frame. So you could see the distortion of these cubes. These are perfect cubes, but you see the distortion in the 15 millimeter camera, and then 36 millimeter restores some of that. And then an 80 millimeter, it's almost like it smushes it. And Dustin last week talked about this like a sandwich, that it's just kind of like a sandwich that's getting smushed, which I think is a great analogy. Another interesting aspect that Dr. Sassy pointed out after last week's episode that I actually never knew before is that lenses don't actually compress or expand or anything. Really what they're doing is magnifying. So if you were to take a wide angle lens and see something off in the distance and like zoom into it, like it would have the same ratios and things like that as if you put on a longer lens. It's just the distortion next to the camera. So really lenses are just magnifying, but I find that that's, even though that's technically accurate and that's actually what's going on, it's kind of confusing to think of things like that way because it's not practical. So typically we talk about things, from like, wide angle lenses making space between things, and then long lenses compressing the space between things. And really what we are saying when we say that is that at the same composition. So it's really only at the same composition that long lenses compress and wide angles expand. So, but just for right now, for the rest of this session, I'm just going to say wide angles expand and long lenses compress, and then in your mind, subliminally, just add in the words like at the same framing, at the same framing. So it's really a matter of you have to combine distance with it in order to get those lens effects. But let's talk a little bit more in detail about wide angle lenses. Because wide angle lenses expand things, again, at the same framing, they tend to make space between things and allow you to get closer to the camera lens. And so you can see here's the camera. We have a fairly wide lens here. So that allows these villagers to kind of, actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to resize this so we can see this a little bit more. So it allows these villagers here to get closer to the camera. And then this like guard comes in and separates them. And by using a longer lens, this looks a lot more menacing. So we're seeing from the point of view of a little girl who's just been like, who's trying to live in secret. She just got discovered. And so then we see this thing, and then this like menacing, towering figure kind of like comes in. And the wide angle lenses kind of distort the faces and make everything kind of a lot more intense. Like we see this woman here, I don't know if you can see my mouse on the screen, but like her head is like 1, 2, 3, 4, like 5 mouse tails, 5 mouse arrows tall.
Yo, that is totally a new unit of measurement. Like it's 5 cursors tall.
It's
That's
5
amazing.
cursors tall, 5 mouse arrows tall. It's the new American system because we just like make up whatever. It's like feet. We're just gonna judge by feet.
It's universal. So
It's gonna be universe. That's right.
Perfect.
It's the new globalization standard. I am 2,700 mouse arrows tall. So if we go back when she first comes into the shot, you know, she is, you know, maybe 3 or 2.5 mouse arrows tall. So we see that there's a great, and it's only a very small distance between like when she comes into frame and when she's here, but with the wide angle lens, it really exaggerates that. We can also see that here in No Country for Old Men. The Coen brothers often use Roger Deakins as their director of photography, and Roger Deakins is known for just really loving using wide angle lenses all the time. Roger Deakins feels that there's a real sense of intimacy that you can feel, because in order to, you know, when you have this kind of framing, when you're using a wide angle lens, you have to get close to the subject. And even though, you know, a lot of people that are watching movies have never like worked on a film set or worked with like, you know, wide lenses or whatever, he says like you could just kind of feel it. You could just kind of feel that the camera is close to the subject, and that creates a sense of intimacy. And so you can see that here, because this dude's head is many, many, many mouse arrows across. It's very large in the frame. But as we go over here to the cowboy hat, which presumably would be larger than his head, is much smaller. So wide angle lenses tend to create space between things and make things in the distance smaller at the same frame size. So again, you know, it's the guy's head and the hat. Very big difference here. Now, long lenses tend to do the opposite. Long lenses, as we saw in the Cinema 4D example, as we saw in this one here, so this is like the default lens with Cinema 4D, but with that same cubes and the same everything framing, we just got to like adjust the camera. Then this is what this is doing. So you can see that it's bringing the background closer to the camera, or with the same framing. It's bringing the background closer to the camera, which appears to kind of like compress the space. And we're going to get into some more practical uses of this in a minute, but what it can do for you is it creates an apparently shallower depth of field, because things that are blurry and off in the distance come closer to the camera. Again, we'll see examples of this in just a second. But longer lenses are typically better for rack focus shots, because you can't really get it's really hard to get a good shallow depth of field look from a wide angle lens. And this is, again, one of the big reasons why I really wanted to do these sessions, because, you know, a lot of times you'll see people who are just using the default camera lens, which is 36 millimeter, which is fairly wide. And by the way, 35 to 50 millimeters is considered like regular. Like that's kind of like the most like human vision, 35 to 50 millimeters. And it's all depending on the camera's sensor size. It can really changes like the focal length and stuff, and the field of view. So that 35 to 50 millimeters, that range is considered the most like human vision. So that's the most kind of like standard, we'd say. So if you want to create something that looks cinematic, that looks engaging, that looks larger than life, then you want to get away from 35 to 50 millimeters. You want to go longer than 50 millimeters, like an 85 or a 120, or you want to go wider. You want to go to like 15 or whatever, because you want to get away from that standard look. And so when a lot of times I'll see somebody made something in like Redshift or whatever, where they're using a wide angle lens, but they have a really shallow depth of field, like that's fake. Like it just feels fake, because that's not something that really happens in the real world. It's very difficult to get an extremely shallow depth of field and that feel when you have a very wide angle lens, because the background is like so spread out from the foreground. So the longer lenses bring that that blurry stuff up close. And again, much better for rack focus shots. If you have one object that's in focus and then you're going to another object that's in focus, that's much clearer when you have a longer lens. Another thing about long lenses is they exaggerate camera shake. So if you have a handheld shot, or if you want to do something that's just like, you know, the camera is like wiggling or vibrating or whatever, you want something that's a little bit more dynamic, it's probably better to use a wider lens for that. It'll have smoother motion. I'll show you an example of that in just a moment. So here's a similar shot. Here's like with the 50mm lens, and it just, you know, if you were on set, if you were like actually here, I mean, this is pretty much what that would look like. This forest feels about as far away from this guy as it does in this shot. So again, this is a very like plain, normal, average way of looking at things, 50mm lens. With a 400mm lens, the stuff in the background, it looks like it's right behind him, even though it's not. And it also looks like it's much bigger than it is. So you can see that this 400mm lens has taken this background, these tiny little leaves, and made them colossal. And again, because it's out of focus, like we talked about Bokeh last week, like it's taken those little tiny leaves that are out of focus a little bit and smashed them into the foreground so that we have what feels like a much shallower depth of field. Okay, so the real point of these lenses, the real point of all of this stuff is for storytelling. And this is kind of like an intro to that idea. So here we have this girl, like in this movie, this little girl is like traveling this, like, also this is a raw shot. So there's like an antenna here that was like cloned out, but this is like the raw shot. So forgive the technology in this like fantasy world shot. But you know, she was traveling this like fantasy landscape where it's just like desolate, and she had so far to climb, and she was walking forever and ever and ever. And so here she was on this like ridge, this bank between like the side of a river. There's a huge river here. She's on one bank, and then there's a bank on the other side. And she had to like cross it on her journey, right? And then there's another shot of her, and it's the same banks, right? You can see this like green on the left, and the stuff across the river. It's the same thing, but just with a wider angle lens and a longer angle lens. And so you could see, again, this is with the 30mm lens and what that ridge on the other side of the river looks like. And here's what it looks like with the 135mm lens. So again, this is where it comes into play with storytelling. Because if we want to make it seem like her journey is long and it's one of endurance, they would use a wider angle lens to make the distance feel way more distant. And so that's the focus with the 30mm lens. That's the story that we're telling, is that there's this great distance and her journey is one of endurance. But if we use a 135mm lens, it makes that opposite side of the shore feel much, much bigger. So it's not distance, but it's also the obstacle is colossal. So if we want to make it seem like her journey is one of strength rather than endurance, then we use a longer lens to make that background bigger. So you can see that, you know, the focal length has a huge role to play in the story that we're telling. And even if we're just making like little like bouncy balls in cinema or whatever, we're still telling some type of story. Do you want to create an illusion that there's like tons and tons of balls everywhere and it's just like going back into the world and it's like colossal? Or do you want to tell the story that that there's only a few, but they're just kind of like crashing in on you or something like that? So lenses play a huge role in the story that we're telling and can help us craft our shots much better or more intentionally, I should say. Another thing to point out about lenses is that when you're at a wide angle lens, there's like every little difference in focal length, like every like millimeter that you change is going to make a really big difference. So like this is like the difference between a 10 and 20mm lens. So just the 10mm right there, when you're at a wide angle lens, makes it a really big difference. But when you're at the other side of the spectrum and you're using long lenses, then those little differences in focal length don't really make as much of a difference perceivably. Perceivably, is that right? You know what I'm talking about. Perceptually, you can't really tell that much of a difference. So like between 210 and 220, it's really not that much of a difference. But between 10 and 20 is really big difference. 210 and 220, not that much of a difference. So differences at wider lengths are wider focal lengths are much more obvious. Okay, we saw that already. Here's the handheld shot. So here's like a wide angle lens. And this is kind of like a handheld shot with a wide angle lens. This is like that same handheld shot, same camera, same operator with a long lens. And you see that it just feels much more exaggerated. And so here's like, you can see the difference with the wide angle lens and a long lens for handheld shots. And you might say, well, who cares? I can make the camera however I want to when I'm doing stuff in Cinema 4D. And that's absolutely true. But the thing is it's really good to be aware that this is the case. If you are moving a camera around, that a wider angle will feel more graceful than a longer lens will. Okay, moving on. Let's see, how are we doing on time here? Okay.
Chad, we have actually had a quick question in from Neil.
Do it.
So he was wondering, is there a theory around not mixing lenses in an edit? For example, 80mm shot morphing into a 35mm will jar too much. He says, I know it's perhaps shot specific, but are there some definite no-nos?
That is a really, really great question. Like, one of the things I really wanted to get into in this month that I just don't think we're gonna have the time to get into is about editing and digital cinematography, because once you start talking about the edit, I mean, there are so many more things to consider. There's like the axis of action, also called the 180-degree rule. There are shot sizes, then focal points and things like that. And cinematography, often you find that like cinematographers are also editors, because in order to shoot well, you have to really understand the language of going from a shot to a shot, from one shot to another. But because like a lot of our audience is like motion graphics people, and we don't always like cut from thing to thing, in the work that we do, like I kind of put that at the end of maybe someday we'll revisit that. So it's a really great question. There are not any formal rules about focal lengths and edits that I'm aware of, but you do want to make sure that your frame changes enough. So like if you like have a 30mm lens and then you push in for a 50mm lens to get in closer, like that, depending on the framing, that might not be enough of a difference in order to cut from a 30mm to a 50mm, if that makes sense. Like we want to see a bigger difference. So I think was that 30% difference, that's just like such an abstract figure, but they said like the frame need to be like 30% larger if you're going to cut in. So there's that. But yeah, other than that, I can't think of any like specific rules about lenses and cutting. Dustin, do you know of any like hard and fast rules about cutting in and out of footage? With, like,
not really that I can think of. I think you pretty much nailed it in that, it just needs to make sense. I feel like that's, when it comes to editing, that's probably one of the hardest parts, especially like you said, like if you're going to be shooting, it makes sense to understand the editing side. It's really, to me, no difference in there being like say like hard and fast workflows for the visual side of it, but not having an understanding for post-production can make it a lot more difficult for the guys in the tail end. So just understanding what your goal is and making sure that you have enough tools to complete that task. So like as you said, like if you're shooting two shots that are pretty much the same, the same composition, like you might not have anything to cut to. So, making sure you have what you need and that things are changing enough. But yeah, there's a lot that goes into it, like you said.
Yeah, and so here's an example of, let's see, where were we at with the, oh yeah. Oh, here we go. So like, when you're going to a really long cutting to a really long lens like this, it is like a very very surreal thing because, or I should say, whenever you're cutting into, yeah, like if you're a super tight shot that's with a really long lens, our eyes are so not that way. Like our eyes are so not 400 millimeter lenses that it can feel like very jarring unless the shot, but like beforehand. So like say we're at this shot, like with the preacher, and maybe we have a shot, like maybe we slide the camera over so the preacher's head is like right here. Um, then we can cut in from 50 millimeter to 400 millimeter because it makes sense. We're seeing the same thing, especially if his head is in the same area of the frame. So like our eyes are already focused on. So then the idea that the language, the visual language of cutting in from that point and then zooming in much closer to that point makes visual sense. But if we were like starting with like the wide shot, like right here, and then we were cut to even though these actually were filmed in the same location, like the same spot, you could see like, yeah, these trees right here, this is the same background as the preacher. But if we were to cut from this wide shot to this shot, it wouldn't make as much visual sense because we need to kind of be able to orient people with where they are spatially. So just kind of like jumping to these like really long shots, you have to be careful with. But yeah, I guess that's like more of an editing thing, but that's fun to talk about too. But speaking of editing, this might help as well. The example that I was going to use for storytelling, the famous example, like Film School 101, is like 12 Angry Men, Sidney Lumet's masterpiece from the 1950s, about these jurors that were kind of like deciding the fate of this guy who was on trial for murder. And, it's 12 Angry Men because 11 of them were like, yeah, he's guilty, put him away. And then like, Mr. Fonda, a great actor, was just like, oh, you know what? Maybe he's not guilty. I'm not super convinced, and we should maybe not throw away his life, and we should be like a little bit more careful. So when they first start and they're first kind of getting things into play, and they're stuck in this jury room, the whole entire movie basically takes place inside this one jury room. So Sidney Lumet uses wide-angle lenses that expands the space. You see the difference in the size between the fan and this dude's head on the other side of the room. I mean, it's colossal, the difference. And so it just feels like they have space because he's using wide-angle lenses. And as the film progresses, like the focal lengths get like longer and longer and longer. So then they have conflicts later on, everything is using these like longer lenses. So it feels claustrophobic. You could feel like the tightening in, that they're in this room and they're trapped and stuck together in this room. And the longer lenses kind of contribute to that feeling that there's just not any space. So the opposite is also true, though. Like if you're in, a lot of times on indie productions, you can't really pick where you're filming. You're in a friend's apartment or flat, if you will, like you're in like some big city and stuff like that, and it's like a tiny little spot. So you might want to use wider angle lenses and back away from the subject so you don't get distortion. But then it just kind of makes it feels like there's has a little more space to it. And I'm gonna turn this over to Dustin in just a second here. But one of the examples I think is like really, really cool. Oh wait, I didn't. Hold on a second, I didn't do this right. There's another example that I missed. 1 second here. 1 second. Oops. Okay. Here's another dramatic example of when these like longer focal lengths come in handy. So we filmed this in the rain. By the way, about rain, speaking of cinematography, I didn't know this until this shoot like 10 years ago. But the way rain works is that you don't really see it when it's front lit. So if like the lighting comes from the same direction as the camera, you can't really see rain. It has to be backlit. And so you can see that here, that like, it's raining everywhere, but we can only see it where the light is lighting it up. So the bounce that's coming from the building, from the camera, it's not illuminating light or any of the rain at all. So again, knowing these things about the way lighting works in the real world, if you like are making a composite and you're using some kind of like, particle effect with rain and the light's coming from the camera, we should be able to see it. So just a thing to to be aware of. So here's an example where like I got all scaried up and I got a piece of a C-stand and I'm chasing this our actress Eva around. And this is with the wide angle lens. And again, when you have a wide angle lens, you typically get the camera closer to things because it exaggerates distance. You can get closer to the subject. But then also when you have a wide angle lens, things tend to distort when they get closer to the lens, and they tend to travel faster as they get closer to the lens. So it's not very scary. If I'm this creepy dude that's stalking her and she's running away, it's like with the wide angle lens, she's like, it's fine. She's getting away from me and it's no problem. And I'm like walking all serious and creepy, but she just runs a little bit and she just smokes me and gets away, and it's not very dramatic. But if we use a longer lens, because we are compressing the space, then as she's running, it doesn't feel like she's getting very far, because in order to get a similar framing, we have to back the camera up. So then we are kind of seen together, and so she's running, but she's not getting much further away. So seeing those side by side, here's the wide on the left and the long on the right, and she easily gets away from me on the left, and on the right she's running, but it just doesn't seem like she's getting anywhere. So you can see how focal length becomes a very powerful storytelling tool. Okay, so last week we didn't have time to turn over to Dustin to get more into like, you know, all the business of like showing us what apertures and focal length look like in cinema cameras and Redshift cameras. So we have that time finally now, and we're right on track as far as time goes. So Dustin, can I turn this over to you to illuminate our minds and hearts with juicy info about cameras? And
yeah, I'm trying to get my my render view squared away here a minute.
okay.
And I think we're almost there. I had
Are there any
to
questions in the chat or anything like that while you're rendering your business?
No, Sharon's made a point of saying always wet the ground, whether day or night, always makes it look better.
It
So I
does.
think of that.
yeah.
It does. It reminds me of Ellie's hands-on with Redshift in February that blew my mind and taught me Redshift, where you had like wet ground like that. Showed us how to do that in Redshift. It was amazing.
Oh yeah, and then you made it like a million times better with the rain.
No, you did all the cool things.
Scott saying, how wide is too wide?
Oh, that's a very that's a good question. You know, you could have like 30 mil could be too wide, depending on, you know, what you're doing. The longest or the widest lens that I own is 11 millimeters, and it's pretty rare to find lenses that are like wider than that. They're very specialty lenses. Like if you have like a 7 millimeter lens or something like that, they're specialty lenses, so they're hard to find. So as you're doing digital stuff, that's something to be aware of. But really, it's a case by case basis based on like what the framing is and like all of that kind of stuff. So something to be aware of. Also, be aware too that again, the default focal length for Cinema 4D is 36 millimeters, which on the cameras that I own, that's a fairly wide lens. So regardless, that's on the very wide end of the normal spectrum. So you might want to push in like a little bit longer lens for that. Also, things like cameras that tend to be on your person, like for action, things like that. So like cell phone cameras and GoPros, like they tend to have very wide angle lenses because they want you to be able to like just pull out your phone or your camera and just get the shot. And so you want to be able to have like a wider angle lens typically. So a lot of the things about the distortion and, you know, the behavior of these lenses at wide focal lengths, you're going to notice this on, you know, your cell phone cameras and your action cameras and stuff like that. So just something to be aware of. Anyways,
Okay.
Dustin, can I throw it over to you?
Yeah, let's do it. We'll figure it out as we as we get rolling.
Okay. Okay.
I'd like to live on the edge. We all know this.
Yeah. It's fun that way. Um, are we seeing your screen? Yeah, there we go. I see it.
Okay, there we go. All right,
Gorgeous.
so yeah, what do we want to talk about first? I say maybe we can talk about focal length. So let me turn off my camera. It's flashing in my face here. I don't know if you can. I'm sure you can all see it starting to go in and out.
I like the irony that we're talking about like cameras and yours is.
Yeah, yeah. My computer's definitely not
Stop talking about
helping me
me.
out today. All right. So talking cameras. So I have a camera in here in the scene at the moment, and this is a 36 millimeters. So Chad was just talking about the default focal length. So let's zoom right in to one of our spheres here. So it's a very simple scene that I have set up that has a few black spheres on the ground and then a couple gold that we can use to kind of focus in and out and in between to show what the differences are. So if I have say a 36 millimeter, this is the type of general composition. Maybe I can make the render view a little bit larger. There we go. This would be like a general composition that we can use to create some nice distance between the foreground and the background. We can see the HDRI back there, and everything looks, pushed out a ways. Now, when Chad was talking about bokeh, that's where things get a little bit different. So how to control some of this stuff in Redshift is obviously a little bit different than just simply clicking an autofocus button on our camera. So in this case, inside of the Redshift camera, we have our focal length here. We have a focus object, and so this focus object is going to allow us to take any of the objects that are in our scene and automatically focus on that. The caveat to this is that the focus object is going to really take the null information or the point of the null rather than the outer geometry of the object. Am I right by that, Ellie? I feel like this is something I've dealt with.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah. So
we
it's
can,
kind of like center axis point.
yeah. So we can,
Yeah.
let's kind of visualize this a minute. If we head to our Redshift camera tag, we can override our bokeh and give that a moment. We'll see that we have kind of a nice depth of field here that gets started. And maybe we'll go to our camera here, and in the physical side, we can actually change the f-stop once we activate movie camera. So this is pretty interesting. We can activate movie camera, and we'll say, what do we think? Maybe a 2.8, or let's do a 1.8. That's what I have currently, is a 35 millimeter 1.8 aperture. So we'll run with this. So if
Hey,
we
Dustin,
wanted to, yeah, go ahead.
can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So one of the things I've always wanted to know, and I just always forget to ask, for if you're going to do the physical camera, do you have to use the physical renderer, or can I use the standard renderer, or can I use Redshift? Because like I feel like I want to fiddle with these settings. I want to fiddle with like the movie camera settings, but like I also don't want to use the physical render because I don't know the physical renderer at all.
Yeah, so this is the only one that I use, is just the f-stop here on this side of it, if I want to change this in what I would perceive as realistic increments, right? So if you're wanting to adjust these, I mean, we can change some of this right now. Let's see here. We'll do a
But
shutter
like,
angle.
Can you still render in Redshift when you've enabled the movie camera and you're fiddling with the f-stops here? I mean, I
You
guess you
can
can
with
because
the
you're seeing.
with the f-stop. Now, if I go to exposure and I
Mhm.
turn my gain up, we'll say to 100, this isn't going to show us anything. So
Ah.
from my experience, and I honestly haven't played with this too much. I just know that if you want to change the f-stop in realistic, kind of what we know is like camera increments, if you will, this is where you can change that by activating the movie camera. Because if we go to Redshift and we go to Bokeh, this is going to be quite a bit different, where we're dealing with a circle of confusion radius rather than just thinking in f-stops. And that it gets very very confusing at that point. So what I like to teach people is like, hey, if you're a photographer getting into Redshift and you want to shoot with a 35 millimeter 1.8 lens, then you can head to the physical tab, press or activate the movie camera and then adjust your f-stop there. So if I'm shooting with say my 35 1.8, like this is how I would just go in there and kind of match up some of these things.
Okay, now that's not adjusting your exposure, right? That's just adjusting. What is that adjusting?
This
Like
is
the
just
size
a,
of the
this
bokeh?
Yep. So this is just the affecting your depth of field.
Depth
So
of
if
field.
we head into our Redshift camera and we head to our exposure, this is where we're going to be able to override and enable like our film settings. So this is where we can change our ISO. Now, all of these things aren't really going to um, kind of affect the depth of field. So for instance, we have an f-stop. Let's change this to something crazy first, so we can really see the depth of field getting pushed. We'll head to physical and we'll do something like f1. There we go. I think we'll be able to see that pretty well. And we can focus pick on the front sphere here. There we go. So now we have quite a bit of kind of blur happening in the background. We'll head back to our exposure tab in the Redshift camera tag. And in this case, now if we take our f-stop and we bring this to, a 2.4, what this is doing is just affecting the exposure. This isn't adjusting the overall depth of field that we're having. So being able to work with them independently is pretty cool, but at the same time, it's kind of somewhat broken, mentally, like you have to get used to doing it that way. But it does allow you to do a lot more creative things in what I would consider post-production or the 3D side, versus doing this yeah, there you go. Oh, I just lost all of them. Jamal, yeah, it's more art directable. All right, so let's change this back to something not so crazy. We'll do a 1.8 here and kind of let this take over a little bit. So we can change our f-stop number, the amount of light that we want to come, through the lens or our aperture, if you will. So we'll change this back to f8. Shutter time, I know that you were talking about shutter time quite a bit and the exposure that you can adjust there. So if we're at like 1/100th of a second, we can say maybe 2000, and you're just going to start crushing down that light, just like you would normally with shutter speed. And it's, the ISO here, normally if you're running at something like a 1600 ISO, you're going to get a whole lot of grain in your scene. On the 3D side, it's really not so much. So when it comes to like the exposure controls that we have here, let me see. I think you got there still a bit fuzzy on whether or not the movie camera settings work in Redshift. No, so they don't. Um, the movie camera settings for the f-stop work. The exposure isn't going to work in Redshift that way, if that makes sense. Hopefully that clarifies it a little bit, Drake. Yeah. Okay. So when I'm working in Redshift, the only thing that I'm adjusting is the movie camera's f-stop, and that's it if I want to control depth of field. From the exposure side, the Redshift camera tag, and then I adjust my exposure from that point. To be quite honest, most often I'm not even touching the exposure because there's quite a bit here that I could just do in post to start evening things out if I needed to. So I'll generally work with the exposure that I have and getting my what you could consider like nice lighting done, you know, in my environment, and then I'll focus in post-production on making specific objects pop and things of that nature. So hopefully that helps. Does that make sense? All right. So how do we get, you know, we've talked about bokeh. One of the things that I know we had talked about a little bit in previous weeks are things like, you know, chromatic aberration, you know, in our bokeh and how we get some of that stuff. So through Redshift, it's pretty cool because we can use a bokeh image. So inside of the Redshift camera tag, we can head to bokeh. We have our bokeh image. We can turn this on. And let me see, I believe I have some of these. Holy cow. Let's get into this side. Okay, so I've got a watch folder set up to my system here, and we're going to use this chromatic aberration image. Pretty much, it's a circle created in Photoshop with a red, white, and blue gradient. We can pull this directly into our path. There we go. All right, so it's coming in now. We can pull that directly into the path here for our texture. And what this is going to do is allow you to start getting some nice aberration or chroma split right inside of your render view. There's a ton of different bokeh textures out there. I know Grayscale Gorilla just had some awesome ones that they released in Pixel Lab as well. So getting these type of looks is immediately going to give you an interesting result where everything is red and it doesn't really look that great. And so the way that you adjust this is simply by changing the normalization mode from none. If you go to white color sum, that's how you're going to be able to get just that small RGB split. Oh, if I can click, there we go. So once this starts to render out a bit more, we'll kind of let that sample for a minute. We can see that we're already starting to get a split here as the bokeh starts to get pushed back further into the background. And so with a 35 or a 36 millimeter camera in this case, we can see that we're able to see quite a few different spheres in this space. And it really gives a sense of scale, you know, as Chad has talked about, to the environment in this sense. You can see quite deep into the environment. Now, if we take our same camera and we change in our object tab, we change to maybe something like an 85 millimeter portrait lens, we can immediately see how this is really going to start to push that camera in. And so this is what we've been talking about with the compression and the way that this works. So for me, I like to use this for, say, macro shots. I'd like to do like pretty kind of detail rendered of things, you know, close up. And as we start to back away from the scene or back out of the environment, we're still starting to see exactly what Chad was talking about. You know, where you can still get very similar compositions, but now this scene looks a lot smaller because that background is pulled in quite a ways. And in order to get these same cool kind of foreground elements, we have to place those in our scene. I'm over here talking to my camera, realizing that I turned my camera off. So, you know, as we're starting to do this, you know, we're starting to miss some of like that foreground activity, if you will. And so this is where you would generally do things like, you know, have focus through objects in your scene. And if you ever, you know, kind of look at some of the work that I do when I'm portrait compositing, this is something I do all the time. I'll just grab random elements, place them in the foreground, kind of help out and create a sense of depth. But when you're shooting with longer lenses, this can also throw you off in a sense, because, you know, for instance, we take the sphere here and we place this sphere all the way in the foreground. You know, because we're dealing with, you know, this compression, you're really starting to cut away from that original composition, versus having something like a 35 millimeter lens. And let's change this back. We'll just go to 35 now instead of 36, where if we wanted to get back to something like kind of that cool original composition that we had, we're definitely going to be able to sit with something like this, where now we have some, you know, out of focus elements in the foreground. We have, you know, plenty of information in the background, and we can really start to set up some nice compositions that would be going on in the scene. So when we're, let's see, I see that Drake is grayscale. Chad Perkins in particular says the unit intensity over the white color sum. Huh. Yeah, I'd have to look into that, Drake. That's a good point. I'll check that out. All right. So is there anything before we talk about bloom and glare type of settings, Chad, that we want to kind of look at in particular?
Not that I can think of.
Okay. So the bloom and glare kind of lens effects, I guess we could call them, in the Redshift camera tag are pretty easy to work with. I like that you have individual control over all of these. So we've talked about, you know, bloom or diffusion a little bit in previous weeks. This is kind of where you get a nice glow throughout the scene. We can take our threshold up. The threshold is pretty much going to be a cutoff. So if we remove it all the way, this is going to allow us to step up and really more or less art direct exactly where this bloom is happening based on the exposure that we have in the background. We have our flare, which is going to give us some nice lens flares, and we can see these here. Not quite as cool as what we have in After Effects with Red Giant. It's a little bit different. But the cool part about this is that as we start to increase our threshold, this is giving us more of the effects that I would use in real, I say real photography, but when I'm out on set shooting, you know, having like focus through objects. Chad, I'm not sure if you've ever done this more in the cinematography space, but you can grab different prisms and things of that nature and like place those in front of your lens and shoot through those. You know, using these flares in a little bit more of a creative space like this to create some type of, you know, kind of haze, like a focus through object, is really cool to do, even if your brain doesn't immediately say, hey, I need a lens flare there. The cool part is that you can really start to adjust the intensity of these. For instance, I can bring this up quite a ways and act as if I have something here in the foreground, and then you can adjust your tint, you know, based on the steps of this as well. So it gives you some kind of cool creative elements that you can use in your scene. And we'll turn that off for a moment and we can turn the bloom off. So our streak is going to be more what we're getting when you're kind of talking about glints. And this is more like the little star-shaped patterns that you get, you know, from metallic objects or lights that are in your background. When would you use these the most? I know in the ArcViz space, Chad, for us, like this is where I would deal with this quite often. In cinematography, do you really shoot for kind of glares and glints? Maybe outside of like automotive headlights?
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I try to avoid that stuff where I can, unless the whole scene is just kind of like bathed in this like surreal thing, and like that's just kind of like the world. But if I'm shooting something like that, that's the focus, and I otherwise want a clean shot, then like I try to do that kind of stuff in post where I can. I guess it's a case by
Right.
case basis, but yeah,
It's probably more just when you're shooting for fun, I would assume, to do some of these
yeah.
things in camera. Um,
hmm
So dealing with the streaks, we can actually turn this up. Let's see. We'll turn down here. We can turn our intensity up. Let's see if we can crunch the threshold just a little bit more. There we go. And increase the tail length. All right. So I'm going to turn off my little focus picker here. And now we can start to turn up our thresholds so we can hopefully see some of these a little bit better. All right. So once we have the streaks in here, you know, the cool part about this is it's a very easy way to get almost like anamorphic flare type of looks. So we can change our number from 3, and we could head up quite high here, and we can see that there's a bunch of rays that are happening from the background. If we head down to 1, maybe go to 2, it might be easier to see here, and change our angles that we have, we can really start to get some of these streaks that happen, you know, across. Now, I could obviously sit here and try to get these to line up perfectly if we were to head down to 1. Let's see if we just go straight to 90, 0. There we go. It just makes it hard to see, probably more because of the shot that we have. But what this will do is this will give us a really nice flare that we can start to use. I like to use this with actual light sources more than at, you know, say having an HDRI in the environment. So I'll place maybe some cool bokeh lights, you know, just a cloner with some emissive sphere type deals in the background, and really start to spread out, you know, with some of these different flares and glint looks. But yeah, so that pretty much kind of covers on the Cinema 4D side. So to slightly recap, when I'm working in Redshift, I'm using the movie camera for the f-stop to control just a general, what I know as, you know, different aperture points that I'm dealing with, or different f-stops that I'm dealing with from the photography side. And then if you want to adjust your exposure further than light balancing, I'll say, that's when you could use the redshift exposure adjustments and really start to hone those in, but those don't affect the actual depth of field that you have set up through your camera either. So both of them are independent. Yeah, and they work pretty well.
Sweet, Dustin. Thanks, man. Thanks for giving us the tour, answering all the questions about the Redshift Cinema 4D workflow stuff. That's very illuminating. I learned a lot about a lot of those things. Very cool. Can I steal the screen back from you?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
The grand finale thing here. Okay, so you see my screen?
Yeah.
I think.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So we talked before about like making this beautiful shot. So let's just kind of go through this really quick and the steps that we did to take this kind of like mundane, kind of unflattering shot to something really spectacular. So the first thing we did is that we realized that you know, we're using a wide angle lens. So we're seeing distortion in like her nose because that's like the closest to the camera. Also like in like the sweater that she's wearing, even there's some distortion there. And that's just kind of like what happens when you have the camera like this close to somebody's face. It's just doesn't do anybody any favors, especially when you got like a nose like this one, like the wide angle lens, like that's all you see is just like 80% nose. So we backed up the camera, and in order to maintain the same framing, we had to use a longer lens, and that's just going to be more flattering, as we'll see. Another thing that you know, when you're on set, a lot of times you're fighting for light, and so it can feel counterintuitive to turn off lights that are there. But when we were in this space, this was just kind of just like an office building, and so like there were these overhead fluorescent lights, which are just not flattering because look at like the shadows under her eyes. You know, we all think like, oh, sunlight's like so beautiful, but like the sun at high noon, light coming from directly above you is like one of the least flattering, ugly things. It makes these like, you know, it takes the brow and it makes a shadow under your eyes, so we all look like just like dead zombies. I mean, it's just very, very unattractive. So backing up, and then we turned off the lights, and so we replaced them with lights that we could shape. So we lit from an angle. We use these LEDs, and LEDs are already kind of like a softer light source because they're tiny little things that kind of like shoot light in all directions. So they tend to like just bounce. So it's just softer light generally. But in addition to that, we also put diffusion and also a gel, like this like little orange cellophane looking stuff, to create like a warmer light. And then also this paper on top of it, it diffuses it even more. And as if that wasn't enough to clamp some diffusion on there, we also put a silk in front of it. So we had a soft light source diffused with the paper that we had over there, diffused with a silk. So this light is just as soft could possibly be. And then we turned out the lights again. So now we're just being lit by, she's being lit just by our lights there, not from the overhead lights. And then we also added this light in the back as kind of like a hair light. And so you can see it's not directly a hair light. It's not coming from behind, like some of the examples that we saw earlier this month. It's kind of like an actual hair light. So it's like lighting her hair. But the difference that it made is just really, really spectacular. You can see the hair light here. It's not coming from behind like a typical standard hair light, but it still creates the separation from her hair and the background. It also breaks up the monotony of just like solid hair color there, and creates just like this really beautiful look. And you can see just like the softness. I mean, we kind of like almost would have the Rembrandt lighting here, but it's just the light is like so soft that it doesn't create that. But now she has like eye lights. We're seeing the light in her eyes because light's coming from this direction, not from this direction. So just to see, just to recap what we have so far, this is what we had with the wide angle lens. And so again, just look at the distortion. Like it's just like it looks like she has a different face because of the wide angle lens. And also just again, the color and quality of the light is just so much better lighting it ourselves. And so that's what we did first there. Then we did a little bit of production design. We made her up. We had sent her off to go like get like, you know, fancied up, put some makeup on, put a dress on or something like that. Just whatever she felt was fancy. And then we also put up some Christmas lights, just standard Christmas lights, just draped from a C-stand. So there'd just be some kind of visual interest. And then we just sat her back down in the same spot. And that was, you know, much better. It was a much cooler scene, much more visually interesting, much better. But we can, one of the things that like just makes the shot so much better all the time, like just almost without exception, space, separation. It just makes things so much better. So separating the camera from the subject and using a longer lens, and also separating the subject from the background. So we had her pick up her chair and let's get away from this background. And that way we can use a longer lens. And we saw this before with opening up the aperture. And then now we have something that's like a lot more dramatic and gorgeous. Another thing that we did is just like what we just saw with Dustin's thing, is that like right here, there's a really great thing in the midground with her. There's some really beautiful stuff happening in the background with the Christmas lights, but there's really nothing in the foreground, and we wanted to move the camera. So you typically want something in the foreground, middle ground, and background to really complete your shot. Now, not all the time, but oftentimes that can make things look more full. So just like Dustin's thing, I just grabbed some Christmas lights and stuck them on top of a tripod close to the lens. And then we slid the camera, and then those lights in the foreground give you kind of a sense of like where you're at. And then finally we slid, and then we had her step into focus. So we had a little bit of blocking to that, sliding the camera, some foreground stuff, and we ended up with a really beautiful and elegant shot. And these little things, kind of like the little like flares that Dustin was adding in Redshift. When you're adding stuff in the extreme foreground, you may or may not want stuff there all the time, but especially if you need like a depth cue to help with a shot that's moving, that really helped us in this case and made a really beautiful shot. So again, no money used, like we just, and that's the before and after, the before and the after there. It's like pretty incredible difference. Same model, same camera, same space, same day, but just kind of using a little bit of cinematography knowledge, we create something that's, you know, much more elegant and beautiful, which is really fun. That's the point of this month, is to take our renders from the stuff on the left to the stuff on the right, to be able to like them in the best way, to use the right focal length of the lens for the situation, and to frame it in the right way based on the focal length and the situation we're trying to create, the story that we're trying to tell. and all of that. Use the hardness of the light that we need to tell the story that we want, and all those things. So I think that's pretty much it for the month of training. Are there any other questions or comments or anything? Any
I
final?
think you answered a lot of them. We had one earlier from David saying about replicating anamorphic lenses, but as Dustin was sort of like going through all of the tips, especially with like the bokeh and the light streaks inside of Redshift, I think that was answered pretty well.
Yeah, so it's
Look.
kind of it gets difficult sometimes, I'm sure, as everybody can tell, to like we all want to cram so much into one space. So we could talk for hours. I know I could talk for hours on really any given topic. So I did want to hit on Drake's comment. So when you're dealing with bokeh textures, and I probably should have had two separate examples of this. So the one that I used where you kind of have a split of colors that are going inside of that texture, that's where I'm going to use the white color sum and kind of, you know, bring a little bit of that chromatic split towards the outside, but keeping our normal colors on the inside. When you're dealing with other textures that have that RGB split on the outside of the texture, that's where you can actually use the white. I believe it's the unit intensity, and it's going to be a little bit different. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit of that up. Good comment that you left there, Drake. I appreciate that. Yeah. Yeah. Bokeh textures. If you haven't played with them before, do that. They're fun.
There's lots
Yeah,
of
that's
nice
really
comments as
interesting.
well that you guys are probably seeing. So Scott's saying it's like very helpful. Jamal's saying good stuff. Anders saying excellent. Got me experimenting again with lights and post effects. And I think I'll kind of like ditto what they're saying. I know I wasn't here live for 2 of the sessions, but I did catch up on them. And it's so much amazing information that I didn't know anything about, or kind of only knew a small percentage of. And I like the idea around it telling the story, because that's like the purpose at the end of the day, isn't it? And perhaps there aren't these sort of like strict rules. It's what looks good for the story or the shot that you're doing. And I think it was, yeah, some really amazing information. So great job to the two of you. Seriously.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks so much
thanks.
for being here, everybody. And yeah, good comments we've been getting. And yeah, it's really great. I'm glad that people like appreciated this, because it's like one of those things that like, oh, I wish I would have had that when I was first trying to like learn. It was like digital stuff when I was like first getting into After Effects. If I would have understood a little bit more about like lighting and camera work and stuff like that, it would have been really helpful. So very cool. Very cool. Thanks everybody for. Do I need to turn this back over to
Cool.
you,
So
Ellie? Surrender
Man, is it
this?
over already?
I
yes,
know.
we're
Like
over,
the entire
but
month.
we can before we wrap up. I'm gonna sort of like teaser what's happening next month, because as everyone knows, we
Oh,
do a
yeah.
new topic every single month, and this was the final one of digital cinematography. But as of next Monday, so it's going to be on the events page, I believe, later today or tomorrow for you all to register. We're going to be the official title is Sculpt Your Own Assets with ZBrush. So myself, Dustin, I believe you're going to be there, and Ian, who is an incredible ZBrush artist and trainer. We're going to be spending, I believe, 5 weeks in October. We get a
5
special
weeks.
extra one because it's Halloween. And we're going to be basically diving into creating our own assets for Cinema 4D inside of ZBrush. And it's going to be a really nice introduction if you've never used ZBrush at all. We're going to be creating some little sort of like Halloween pumpkins, like a tombstone, and we're going to create all of those bits every single week. And Ian's going to be showing us sort of some introductory brushes, and then we're going to take those using GoZ into Cinema 4D. And then I believe in the final week, Dustin, me and you are going to put together a bit of a render with these assets that we've all spent 4 weeks creating in October, and do some materials and some lighting, and have an audience-led Halloween special. So I think if you're like me and you've either not gone into ZBrush at all, or you've only really just started to scratch the surface, this is going to be absolutely perfect for you, especially if you have things like Maxon 1 and you have ZBrush now anyway. And so I'll be there with you all, kind of learning on my sort of like driving lesson inside of ZBrush. And I think it's going to be an amazing, like definitely an amazing series. So if you're into learning ZBrush, yeah, I think it's going to be a really great one. Building your own assets. If like me, you're not much of a modeler inside of Cinema 4D, hopefully we can dive into ZBrush and start learning some cool stuff.
Sounds amazing.
Yes, that should be on the events page soon for you all to register. Do a little Halloween special.
Love Halloween.
Cool. Well, once again, guys, amazing job. As you can see by the comments, it's been an amazing month with you all. Sorry I haven't been here on every single one, but it's nice to see you on this final one and sort of say hey.
Yeah, for sure. It's good to have you back.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody again for joining us. It's awesome.
Cool. Well, have a good rest of your week, everyone, and we'll see you next Monday for the start of a new series.
Awesome. Bye, everyone.
Everybody.
Bye, everyone.